Okay, so I think we're ready to begin. We could all bow in. So, welcome to the Path of Awakening class on Mingyur Rinpoche's book, In Love with the World. And tonight we're going to be discussing chapters 10 and 11, and if we have time, chapter 12. But actually there's quite a bit of material here in these first two chapters, so we may not get to to chapter 12. So I think the chapter 10 has an interesting title. If you see something, say something, which of course is what Mingyur Rinpoche saw in one of his visits to New York. But it has it has some interesting meaning, I think, in terms of what he presents in this chapter. Seeing is connected particularly with the practice of Vipassana, and that's essentially how I understand what's being seen here. If you see something, it relates to what's seen as a result of meditation practice. But it also relates to some of the feelings that he has as he's in the train station of Varanasi, where we left him last week, dealing with all of the different feelings and emotions and sense perceptions that are coming up as he's in this hustling, bustling, dirty, chaotic train station, having left behind the structure and familiarity and comfort of his monastery that he was a part of. So, if you see something, say something. That's the title of this chapter 10. So it begins by saying that he returned to the stone floor of the train station from the dormitory where he had gone to sleep. If you remember from last week, he had decided that enough was enough and that he needed to take a break from some of the chaos and all of the other things that he describes in this book, In Love with the World. So he returns to the stone floor from the dormitory where he had his own bed, and describes it as a descent back into hell, though less dense, and people seemed less angry, but that again there's a real intensity to the experience of being in the train station of Varanasi. And if you've ever been to India and seen how crowded and chaotic and just the mass of humanity that you can encounter in the cities in India, you'll know what he means. It's extremely overwhelming. So he brought some biscuits and tea with sugar, sat and ate, and then began thinking about his trip to New York, where he saw the sign that said, if you see something, say something, which, as we know, related to the kind of urgings that we ran into after the attacks back in 2001. But in any case, if you see something, say something. And I really think this relates in an interesting way to the practice of Vipassana, whether he meant it that way or not. Anyway, he says that whether it was New York City or Varanasi, that certain things look pretty similar. And in particular, he again comes back, as he will emphasize in this chapter and the next, again and again emphasizing the nature of impermanence and the realization, the recognition, the full understanding of impermanence as a doorway to understanding something of emptiness, shunyata, and egolessness, identitylessness, which is, again, quite a theme that will come up again and again in these two chapters. What he says is what seems similar is that we embody moment-to-moment physical changes, traverse different realms of affliction each day, and live through continuous, never-ending changes in our daily lives and in the environment. That everything is in constant flux, everything is changing. The weather changes, our mind changes, our body changes. And then he says that accepting impermanence intellectually is the easy part. Again, we can at least understand impermanence as an external phenomenon. We see the seasons change. We see other people change. We see things around us change constantly. But that to understand impermanence as also involving our internal states may not be so easy because we get caught up moment to moment in whatever dramas, storylines, and dreams come across our mind. And this is where the practice of meditation becomes so important, that it's by settling our mind, first of all, in shamatha practice, and being able to just simply stay with our experience moment to moment, allowing ourselves to slow down, settle, that we begin to see how much internal change is occurring as well. That our mind changes constantly, that as he says, we go through different realms of affliction each day, moment to moment. Also, accepting impermanence intellectually as the easy part gets at another idea, which is that conceptual mind from a Buddhist point of view can be very deceptive. And in particular, the biggest deception is that we tend to mistake concept for actual experience. And this is true with something like impermanence, which is not necessarily a concrete thing, but have you ever had the experience of looking at a table, looking for something, not seeing it, and then suddenly realizing it's right there on the table in front of you? That's because somehow we've had some kind of an idea of something that has, for a moment at least, blinded us to what's really right in front of us. And this is because we get lost in concept. If you've ever had the experience of going for a walk or a drive and be so caught up in some kind of internal thought process, thought pattern, that you're barely aware of your environment. Same thing again, that it's easy for a concept to get lost in concept and not have a mistake concept for direct experience. He goes on to say that although we might be able to accept impermanence intellectually, we seem to lack a good understanding of how to use this information, how to put it into service for the enrichment of our lives and others. And that's really what the heart of this chapter and the next one is about. How to use this information, especially the next chapter, how to use this information, how to use recognition of impermanence, the reality of impermanence, how to put it into service for the enrichment of our lives and others. Anyway, he says to himself at this point in our text, he says, I didn't have to stay stuck in my Mingyur Rinpoche identity. I would not. But then he says, this is what I don't see. What's holding me back? And then he muses, how confusing that our habits promise so much comfort even when they work against us. Based on what I see, I say that resistance to change puts us at odds with reality, and this creates never-ending dissatisfaction. So again, our habits promise so much comfort even when they work against us. And again, we will see as we go through this chapter and the next how attachment, grasping, our habitual grasping in particular at some kind of fixed identity, creates suffering, creates a self-created suffering, and that even though it promises us comfort, it actually provides dissatisfaction. And in this, he's really echoing the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of origin of suffering, and that we can become free of this, the cessation of suffering. And then the path, primarily involving meditation, is how we actually find liberation. So he again talks a little bit about, again, as he's musing about being back on the floor of the train station in Varanasi with all of its hectic activity and crowds of people, that he had some original expectation of that he'd be leaving temple life, the monastery, that it would be replaced with forests and village squares, and that the train station would actually be like his shrine room. And the travelers would be like the stone bodhisattvas at the Mahabodhi temple. And now he's realizing what the reality is. He's just what he's really confronted with, which is, again, all of this chaos, noise, confusion, sensory overload. He says, I would have liked to have looked through a kaleidoscope and jiggled the composition of the dream, for he could not see it as a Buddha realm. In other words, the train station is not his shrine room. It's actually challenging. He said, I could not see it as a Buddha room. And his feelings about the fellow passengers, where he's dealing with some kind of separation and some feeling of being overwhelmed just by this mass of humanity. He says, I could not see that each person had Buddha nature, meaning the innate capacity for wisdom and compassion, and to that same degree that he himself possessed Buddha nature, no more, no less. So that he's having some struggle seeing people the way that he knows how they actually are. The difference is he doesn't get caught up in it, and he's aware that this is what's happening. And again, he'll come back to awareness, come back to realizing that how he's feeling, what he might be seeing, is not necessarily how things actually are. He says by noon he was hungry and was looking for food and decided to sponsor a lunch for his friend, the person that he met, we read about last chapter, in the family. And he describes continuing to watch his mind. So again, for all of the turmoil that he's describing, all of the emotion, all of this sense of being overwhelmed, he never really fully loses his seat. He's always able to see what's happening in his mind. He doesn't get so carried away that he's acting on impulse or habit. So what he describes watching his mind. He says states of mind continue to move through a revolving door with moments of tranquility, followed by aversion, dislike, and judgment. So again, it's just describing the flow of experience through his mind and being able to see it without being caught up in it or without engaging with it and being swept away. Then he says sounds took over as agents of distress. So it was, again, loud sounds, which, as we'll see in the next chapter, were the trigger for his panic attacks when he was younger. That sounds took over as agents of distress. But again, it's essentially the same thing, the sense of sensory, a great deal of sensory input. And he began talking at this point, as he's reflecting on his experience, he begins talking about, in the text, about a student, an Eastern European friend, who he says was gruff but not rude, and who said, this Mingyur Rinpoche's friend, student, that he liked the intellectual rigor of Tibetan Buddhism, but found the tradition too culture-bound and religious. But what bothered him the most, what vexed him the most, was the chanting at the beginning of the meditation session. He said, "I just wanted to sit and meditate." So Mingyur Rinpoche said, "Fine, just do that, no problem." But his friend, this Eastern European friend, still couldn't do it. The room was too noisy. Then Mingyur Rinpoche says he suggested doing sound meditation. In other words, using the sound itself as an object of meditation and coming back to his awareness of the sound as a way of coming back from thoughts and any kind of preoccupation. But he still couldn't do that. He was just too irritated by the sound of chanting. So finally Mingyur Rinpoche asked him, when does the irritation start? And he says with this that his friend realized that his irritation, his aggravation with the noise of the chanting, he recognized that began long before he entered the meditation hall. That he was so attached to his sense of aversion about this chanting and about the sound that his mind had no room for inquiry. In other words, he becomes so caught up in the aversion, his dislike of the sound, the chanting, that he didn't have any opportunity to really look at what was actually happening. But he, at that point, began to be able to let go. And so Mingyur Rinpoche asked himself the same question. And this is, again, Mingyur Rinpoche asking himself about his aversion, sitting on the floor of the train station. When had his own irritation started? He said that he'd had a great deal of joy and excitement when he was planning this wandering retreat. He said that stepping through the gate of the monastery, Tirgar Gate, was like, he described it as being like a shock, like lightning that stopped this busy monkey mind. And that for a moment, he says, all the muttering, all conceptual commentary had stopped, all the internal dialogue had just stopped. And that he had a moment, an experience of mind beyond words and beyond concepts. But then he began worrying when his taxi didn't show up, or came late actually, that he slipped in the mud, and that wasn't really it either. That he knew he was not the Rinpoche label or title, but although illusory realities could be discarded more easily, but he thought that these illusory realities, his holding on to his identity as Mingyur Rinpoche, he thought that that could be discarded more easily than it turned out they could be. He knew that any idea of who he was, any idea of what he might experience, were nothing but ideas, empty concepts, and that this Rinpoche label or anything else didn't really exist as his true self. But he had suspected they might be living more deeply within him than he could recognize within the routine of his days in the monastery. But he had not known the extent to which they had taken up residence in his body. So he's realizing, he's beginning to see more and more how any kind of clinging, any kind of attachment provides the seeds for aversion, provides the seeds for becoming lost in some kind of a dream, some kind of a storyline. And he says that, again, we can recognize this, and we know that because they're fabricated, constructed, they're not inherent, that yes, they could be transformed, but he was realizing that it would take more patience, work, and time than he had foreseen. That they couldn't just be made to stop by volition. This goes back again, when he says they can't be stopped by volition. This goes back. This goes back to in his having some intellectual understanding, but not a real experiential understanding, and not a stable understanding of identitylessness, a real in the moment experience of accepting impermanence and change as the fundamental nature of things. So it's easy enough, as he says, it's easy enough to say I am emptiness, but actually having the experience is something different. So again, he's sitting on the train station floor with all of this chaos and swirling activity around him. He knew that for him to be having these sensations of judgment and aversion and dislike, to be so disturbing means that he had to be misperceiving himself, because that's how suffering always works. Our misperceptions turn us into targets. And then he begins talking, in other words, it's having some sense of this is who I am that is the origin of suffering. It's the origin of holding on to expectation, demand, concepts about how we should be, concepts about how the world should be, that create struggle. And he begins talking at this point about realizing that actually flexibility is more important than any kind of rigidity here. And he talks about watching Tai Chi masters, that with Tai Chi, Asian martial art, if you've ever seen it, that with Tai Chi, defense is based on flexibility rather than resistance. What this is I have not really practiced Tai Chi. There was a period in time where I practiced Aikido, which has some very similar kinds of ideas. The idea in Aikido is it's a fairly gentle martial art, or the idea is that you don't resist, but you actually try to join, and then by joining, direct the flow of energy so that a person is directed away when they attack, if there's some kind of an attack. But in any case, with flexibility, for a martial arts master, the opponent's blow has no place to land. And he says the same is true for a master of mind. The more rigid our sense of self, the more surface we provide for the arrows of suffering to hit. And then he asks himself, who is receiving these arrows? Again, we're back to when does the irritation begin? Who is receiving these arrows? Who is offended by these loud noises? Who else but this High Lama, he's speaking about himself now, who's disgusted by the smell of the toilets and body odor? He says, I wish I could see these vagrants with the same love and appreciation I have for my students. But these people aren't adoring me. They aren't bowing to me. And then he's thinking, but I asked for this. And he realizes, I'm still wearing my superior hats on my head. He's thinking these people are not acting appropriately and I don't know what to do. So, again, as he said earlier when he was watching states of mind, there are moments of tranquility, moments of catching himself, moments of just seeing what's in his mind. So he says, he sat quietly as his breath returned to its normal rhythm. So here again, he's recognizing what's in his mind and not letting it sweep him away, not letting himself be overwhelmed or flooded. He says he sat quietly as his breath returned to its normal rhythm. And he says, I had noticed a growing attachment to his role as a teacher and realized that he'd started to get puffed out like a peacock, that he could almost catch himself by not quite bending in the direction of adulation like a flower turning toward the sun. And that this kind of adulation, this kind of respect as a teacher, felt good until he recognized the hidden dangers that come into focus, and he could feel himself veering off course. So again, he's telling us this is why he wanted to do this wandering retreat, why he wanted to leave the monastery, leave the comfort and security of, his role as a venerated teacher, and actually experience the world in a more direct way. He says that his father told him many times to cut attachments as soon as he could. And in this case, cutting attachment to being a teacher had been a motivation, one of his motivations for going on this wandering retreat. He says, my silent outbursts toward the people around me felt as if a toxic boil had burst, and now the healing could begin. So again, there's as he will describe again and again, there's a moment where the emotion, the feeling, the judgment, the perception begins to well up, and then it's recognized, and he lets go. And when he says that his father told him to cut attachment, one important aspect of the contemplation of impermanence is precisely that we become attached because we think things are going to last. We think that things are fixed, that we think that things are going to always be a certain way. And that the more we understand and recollect and conceive the truth of impermanence, the easier it is to cut attachment, because we realize there's nothing that we can really become attached to. And that in fact, becoming attached is self-created suffering, does create the grounds for struggle and suffering. Anyway, with that, he says that he began walking around the station, he got some water, and he missed his family. And he said he missed being cared for, not just the protection, but the affection as well. And closes the chapter by saying he fought back tears. So, the next chapter is titled A Visit from Panic, My Old Friend. And here again, he's going to continue to talk to us about how to work with meditation practice in the world, how to work with impermanence as a means of coming to understand something about emptiness, egolessness, identitylessness, whatever we want to call it. But it begins with it's a Hinayana teaching in particular that one reason why we don't recognize the nature of things is that the mind is constantly being drawn to outer objects, that we see things in the world around us, take them to be real in a way that they're not, and that we're always caught up in struggle because of our attachment, or in some cases our aversion to outer objects, the things that we see around us, without realizing, so that there's always an externalization of what's really created by mind, and that it's by coming to recognize that is by coming to be able to settle down and take a look inward and see what's in our minds, that we begin to develop some understanding about the reality of things and begin to develop the ability to let go or surrender, so that we don't get so caught up in constant struggle with the world around us. And again, he really emphasizes impermanence as the recognition of impermanence and understanding of impermanence. Again, not simply impermanence in terms of external things, but as well in terms of the impermanent nature of our states of mind. Our emotions, our feelings, our perceptions, our thoughts are always changing. It's also possible, and some teachers do, Thich Nhat Hanh for example, to really get at emptiness and egolessness through understanding interdependence. The fact that things don't stand on their own, but that things come into being in relation to countless causes and conditions and coming together of things, moment to moment. And that for that reason as well, it's precisely because things are compounded, because things only exist in dependence on other causes and conditions, that in fact things don't have any kind of permanent solidity. And that it's through interdependence, in fact, or some understanding of interdependence, that we develop compassion, because we realize more and more our connection with the world around us and come to see that we don't exist as independent things, separated from the world around us. In any case, we return again to the train station floor. And he says, after about an hour of sitting with relative calm, he began to become discomforted, feel discomfort again. He says discomfort again grew like thorns piercing the skin. And he soon concluded that this bad dream that he's in, being in the train station, surpassed the panic attacks he'd suffered as a child. So again, he's going to relate to us how he worked with panic attacks when he was younger, because he says when he was did a 3-year retreat when he was quite young, he suffered from really debilitating panic attacks, and he describes this in some of his other books as well, but it's pretty well described here. And what I really want to focus on is more the instruction and the meditation practice and the realizations, the steps that he comes through in working with panic attacks, because in place of panic attacks, we could think about any kind of strong emotion that affects us: depression, anxiety, becoming easily overexcited, over hopeful, and misperceiving things in an excited, hopeful direction. Any kind of extreme state of mind. In this case, he's talking about his panic attacks, but again, it really could apply to any kind of extreme that we might experience. So in any case, he was doing a 3-year retreat, which is a traditional retreat practice that was done in Tibetan Buddhism, and was struggling with his panic attacks, which he not only was the panic itself very debilitating, but he'd feel embarrassed and didn't want to appear weak in front of other people, and really struggled. This again was fairly young, early adolescence, if I remember the age right. And he went to speak to Taisita Rinpoche, who was a teacher for the retreat, and described that he was having this struggle with the panic attacks. And he said that, he quotes Taisita, "When the affliction of negative emotions is blazing like fire, then wisdom is also blazing like fire." But he says he misunderstood this, that he thought that wisdom in this context is about taking a more skillful or effortful approach to getting rid of panic. In other words, he was looking at the panic as in a dualistic way. Not that wisdom can be accessed when our afflictions are blown up on a big screen in the sky. In other words, he could not at this point in time accommodate the possibility that panic and wisdom might coexist. So he was looking at wisdom as a way to get rid of or avoid the panic, rather than seeing what he later understood Taisita to mean, that when the affliction of negative emotions is blazing like fire, then wisdom is also blazing like fire, and that wisdom is inherently part of the afflictions as well. He said he had the worst and last attack at age 14, near the end of his first year of retreat. And again, he was having trouble with the sound, not just the chanting, but the musical instruments that are like loud horns and drums and cymbals. And that he said he couldn't become bigger than the sound or the fear, and felt humiliated by being perceived as weak and fragile. So he was really struggling with his reaction to loud noises. Thunderstorms, he said, would trigger panic attacks as well. Hailstorms would trigger panic attacks. And it's really connected with sound, which, if you remember, was one of the things that was starting to bother him in the Varanasi train station as well. And then he makes, this is an important sentence, but as anyone in the hell of hatred knows, nothing binds you to the object of hatred more than your own aversion. So that, in other words, the more he fought it, the more solid and intense it becomes, that even trying to push it away is a form of attachment. He says he wanted to apply practice and teachings to these panic attacks. And he references back to, if you remember in one of the previous chapters, the tree branch that broke when he was trying to climb, so that he fell. If a tree with a broken branch was impermanent, surely panic itself was impermanent, he says. And then he said, well, what would that mean? Could it really be that thunder, hailstorms, noise were not the problem? And again, so what he's talking about here is coming to see that the outer objects, the outer objects of perception, that wasn't the problem. The problem is the mind that perceives and interprets and labels. That this, as he says, that this intense suffering inside my body was also a product of mental distortion. He said, he actually questions here, was it true, as the Buddha taught, that ultimately suffering is self-created? Ultimately, suffering is self-created. And I think anyone who's done meditation practice for a period of time at least sometimes sees this, that we create dramas in our own mind that are far worse than many times than things that actually happen. That we can work ourselves up over things that don't happen at all, that we get completely lost in future thoughts without being present at all. Future dreams, future possibilities that never materialize. Or we get caught up reviewing the past and find ourselves in difficult moods over things that aren't actually happening in the present at all, except in our minds. So this is what the Buddha taught, that ultimately suffering is self-created. But we often forget this, and we end up, again, externalizing, seeing things in the world around us as problems, rather than realizing that it's the mind itself that creates these problems. And again, this relates back, again, to the Buddha's noble truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering in particular. And he says with this, so again, his intention was to really look at the nature of these panic attacks, to really look at his mind. So he says he spent 3 days just watching his mind, and he emphasizes just watching. No control, no manipulation, just watching to see that nothing lasted, that everything's in flux, everything's in motion, that perceptions, feelings, sensations just are constantly changing, constantly coming and going. So again, just watching. And so maybe this would be a good time to do just that and take a moment to just do a few minutes of meditation and just watch. Just as he says, take a good posture, upright, alert, and relaxed. Maybe follow the breathing for a few minutes. Just settle with the breathing. And just see what's in our minds. Just watch. So, to continue, because one thought that kept coming up in my mind is I need to work my way through this material. It's difficult to just watch. It's very easy to very quickly get into judgments and feelings, and if the feeling is unpleasant or has some kind of sense of urgency to it, to want to do something about it. But if we're able to maintain some steadiness, then it becomes very clear at a minimum, if nothing else, that in fact things are constantly changing, that what we're aware of from moment to moment, physical sensations, sights, maybe sounds, different thoughts arising, that there's constant change in our experience. So, going back to Mingyur Rinpoche and his working with these panic attacks, he said, I came to accept that I had contributed to fixing these attacks in place, with the two aspects of craving, which he talks about as pushing the problem away to get rid of it, which is one way to deal with something that is negative, or in some way something that we don't like, which only fueled the fear of panic as well as the fear of fear itself. So that's pushing, trying to push it away, and pulling in, as in pulling into his life whatever he considered to be the opposite, some kind of composure, some kind of sense of peace or steadiness. That if, as he says, if only I could be free of panic, my life would be wonderful. And it's this push-pull, which we could also talk about, and we often have talked about, as passion and aggression, passion being the pulling in, aggression being the push away. Or we've talked about it at times about letting go of hope and fear, that hope being, again, the pulling something in, and fear being something that we feel something that we fear as unpleasant. And it's exactly these reactions that if we don't experience with a mind of awareness, but we instead experience with our normal habitual reactive mind, that lead to control and manipulation and fixation. And that this is, as he's saying, this is what fixed his panic attacks into place. So this was the first step, is just being able to see without giving, and see the reactions without then reacting to the reactions. And I don't want that either. I don't want to, you could see the pushing and pulling and then try to push away the pushing and pulling, but that's just more of the same problem. So it's being able to come to a point of letting go, where you can just simply be. But there was still more seeing to do. There was still more that he had to see in this. As he says, I was still dividing his world into opposites, good and bad, light and dark. And he still hadn't figured out that happiness doesn't reside in a problem-free life. So again, this is, accepting the truth of suffering, that the expectation of a problem-free life in itself creates suffering because it's not realistic. Just as the desire for some to hold on to things as if they were permanent when they're not creates suffering. He says, I was beginning to, with this, he was beginning to understand something about how he contributed to his anguish, but it still wasn't enough to let go of patterns. He still couldn't separate himself from the dark panic cloud. He said he had to convince himself in a lasting way, that to convince himself in a lasting way, he would have to reaffirm impermanence in every way that he could. So to do this, he says that every object he experienced became an opportunity to see that his panic was impermanent, that every breath, every sound, every sensation, be the tree outside would grow old and die, his teacher Salje Rinpoche would grow old and die, he himself would grow old and die, that seasons change, that people come and go. He says, the more I examined the transitory nature of all phenomena, the more confident he became that panic was just another temporary cloud, and that he couldn't identify anything in the world that was incapable of change. So with this, you could say the world became his teacher, that when we look and examine, when we're able to see our experience, see things as they actually are, that the world itself becomes a teacher. So he said, okay, this too can change. That his panic attacks. The cloud doesn't have an anchor. Now what? Just because it can change doesn't mean that it will change. So then he comes to the next step. And again, he's talking about his experience during 3-year retreat, working with these panic attacks. He said he was learning something about resting in awareness and becoming more trustful of the knowing quality of mind beyond concepts. So this is the real seeing. This is the real, the practice of Vipassana. As he says, he could, in looking at mind itself and looking at the nature of awareness and the nature of mind itself, that he could see that bringing his mind back from getting lost in outer objects, sense objects, in other words, bringing his mind back from the distractions, sense objects, didn't mean that mind disappeared or died. That taking the mind, as he says, taking the mind off its preoccupation with objects, thoughts, problems, made the mind bigger, vast, clear, and beyond imagination. So that, in other words, as he was able to let go of the preoccupation with outer objects, including objects of thought, as well as, sense objects, began to realize that mind is bigger, vaster, clear, beyond imagination, and becomes more and more able to identify with that as the true nature of mind, as opposed to mind that's narrowed down, caught up in distraction. And he says he came to understand that if he allowed the panic to remain and stayed with the recognition of awareness, so it's not that he was trying to push the panic away or manipulate or control panic in any way, but just that he was able to just allow the panic to remain, but maintain his recognition of awareness, that he would see that the panic is just the display of his mind. With this, panic would self-liberate, meaning that, as he says, panic, as well as our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions, are already free in and of themselves. And they're free, or they self-liberate, because they are truly illusory and truly empty, that there isn't anything permanent, fixed in any of these experiences. And with this, he makes another important statement. The liberation comes with a change of perception. So it's coming to see perception, coming to see the emptiness. But again, not nothingness, but the emptiness in the sense of things not being permanent and fixed. He saw that this liberation would never come from focusing on the problem and trying to get rid of it, because he was seeing that when you focus on a problem as a situation, as something to get rid of, that further solidifies it. It makes it more real. He says what we do is we learn that we can let it be, and then the next cloud will roll in and out. Or again, he comes back to the analogy that he used in a previous chapter of the mind being like a vast ocean and thoughts, feelings, perceptions being like simple waves on the surface of the ocean. That waves will come, turbulent waves will come. They'll come and go. And he recognizes that life's problems never end, but if he stayed with the recognition of awareness, he was able to stay settled in awareness, then he'd be okay. And with this, he said he felt like he finally discovered the only reliable liberation from suffering, which is not trying to get rid of the problem, at least we begin to experience this first in meditation practice. And that this critical insight came from contemplation on impermanence. So again, we're back to seeing that thoughts do not last, that the body is changing, panic is changing. All that we experience is like simple waves on the ocean, rising up and dissolving. And then he said there was the next step that he talks about is that he saw that instead of trying to get rid of panic, he had to get familiar with the rigid sense of self that kept trying to hold things in place. He had to get familiar with the rigid sense of self that kept trying to hold things in place. And notice he says get familiar with it, not try to get rid of it, because there again, that would just be fixating on a problem, which would intensify it and solidify it more. He says he realized he could live with waves of panic, that there'd be other waves, there'd be problems and suffering, but without a fixed mind, these daily life problems could return to the larger, more spacious ocean mind that trying to stop the waves would be like trying to stop the mind. It's just impossible. So that learning to rest in awareness and learning to let go of a fixed sense of mind creates the only real reliable liberation. So he says with this, he felt he had slayed the dragon of panic, and now he brings us back to the Varanasi's train station, because he felt he had slayed this dragon of his panic attacks until he came up with the feelings of embarrassment and the fear of rejection in the Gaya train station, which are now being intensified in Varanasi. And he says, as a child, he had seen that fear or panic could provoke an attack. And again, another interesting phrase, as if the power of projection compelled the event to materialize. As if the power of projection compelled the event to materialize. And we see this in our practice. We see how, beginning with a simple thought, we create an entire world. We become entirely lost in a fantasy, a dream, and lose any sense of present awareness because we get so caught up. And it all begins with this power of projection, the power of getting attached to a single thought and letting that blow up in an entire world, an entire realm. He says that all he had wanted to do was to get rid of the parts of himself that he disliked. He wanted to get rid of them. But now he's coming to understand something of their value as a compost for sanity. So again, back to the train station floor. All of this musing is bringing back to working with himself, working with his mind on the train station floor. Now on the train station floor, I could see fear rising like steam in the opening between me and others. Relating to others as other, you're seeing them as separate from himself. Relating to others as other in some solid way turned them into omens, as he says, omens of calamity. And to eliminate that fear, he realized he would have to become the other, which was no different than dying as Mingyur Rinpoche. In other words, he had to overcome the sense of separation, the sense of dualism, in order to let go of the feelings of aversion, judgment, panic, and so on that would, begin to arise. And again, he just comments on the irony that at this moment, he'd only been away from his home for 48 hours, and and despite naive expectations of instantly releasing identities, he's seeing that the real source of the problem is having a fixed sense of who he was, that was the origin, the fixed mind that he was talking about, that he had it, despite naive expectations of releasing identities, they become more solidified. And with this, he goes back again to his experience working with the panic attacks that you described earlier in the chapter, that he'd let go of the panic attacks because he'd seen that they were empty, that they hadn't plagued him for the rest of his life as he feared they would when he was younger. But now he's working even more closely with an aspect of emptiness around any sense of identity, any sense of ego, any sense of any kind of fixed sense of self. He said he knew that his roles, his role as a teacher, role as a guru, role as Mingyur Rinpoche, he could see that these roles were essentially empty. But what he was experiencing meant they were not nothing. And if you remember, that was the title of the previous chapter, Emptiness, Not Nothingness. That the fact that they're empty doesn't mean that that there aren't appearances, that we don't experience feelings and appearances. And he says with this, that some of his feelings had slumbered, sense of panic, sense of aversion, judgment, had slumbered, but now they were ushered to the surface. But his attitude is different. He says, I welcome the chance to see them in broad daylight. I noted all this. In other words, he's aware. He's seeing what's coming up. And that he felt with this that this was enough, that he had done enough, that he realized, that this was what he was letting go of. This was why he wanted to go on the retreat. This is where he'd add wood to the fire. And by bringing these feelings to the surface, all the sense of aversion, the sense of panic, the sense of judgment, all of this, and being able to see it, that this was enough. And with that, he returned to the dormitory for the evening. And he says, I am not my embarrassment, I told myself. I am not my confusion. Even though these feelings felt solid enough to get slapped. In other words, he's able to recognize thought as thought and not identify with the thoughts. He was able to see, this is how I'm feeling, but that's not how things really are. He was able to see thought as thought and see the emptiness or transparency of thought. And with this, he brings us back to the conversation with the monk Nagasana. I think it's probably pronounced Nagasana. Nagasana, who he described in the previous chapter as saying, because of my body, my feelings, perceptions, and so forth, Nagasana exists as a denotation, a name, a conventional usage. But ultimately, there's no person to be found. So this was Nagasana talking to the king about whether there really truly was anything that was permanent or unchanging, independent, and singular, that you could say this is who this person is in any kind of solid, unchanging way. And Nagasana said he was not, that there was just a name, it's a nominal self, but not a real, permanent, fixed self of any kind. No, which again, no real being in that sense. And he said he was lying in the dormitory thinking about this and he arguing with Nagasana. It says, I'm here, I exist, how can I not be here? And then he quotes his conversation with Salje Rinpoche, his teacher, when he was younger. That Salje Rinpoche said, you're here and you're not here, both. And gave the analogy of a grass rope and the ash rope, which, so the idea of the grass rope and the ash rope, if you remember from the chapter, is the grass rope seems to exist and has some solidity, but if it's lit on fire, it burns completely and it's just ash, so that it has no real solidity. And in this was used, he's using this as an analogy, that the grass rope is like the conventional self, the self that we give a name to, but that doesn't have any real inherent unchanging nature. And that the ash rope is the mere self, which he describes as the fully functioning I or self, cleansed of selfish concern. It's the awakened self, freed from the grasping self, and therefore liberated from attachment to the labels that make up our identity. This is the healthy self taking direction from its own sanity, not tyrannized by the habits of grasping. So what's being presented here is in a notion of self that's different from how we usually think of self, as something that's ongoing, unchanging, lasting. It's in some Mahayana teachings, what we'll talk about is almost a real self, but it's a self that doesn't truly exist in the sense that how we usually think of things existing. It's just our ongoing awareness, our Buddha nature, that, again, takes direction from its own sanity, and that it isn't tyrannized by the habits of grasping. And it's, as he says, it's not nothing, this mere self. It's not nothing, but it's not solid either. It's like the ash rope. It has no real solidity, no real permanent existence. And that the notion of mere, M-E-R-E, undercuts the misperception of an unchanging fixed self, which he describes that this mere self, like the ash rope, is more like a hologram, that it's a visual form, but it's not weighted down by habitual patterns of grasping, and more importantly, not weighted down by the tendency to merge our identities with external phenomena. So external phenomena meaning any kind of social role, as well as our thoughts themselves, that we don't identify with any particular thought about this is who I am. And it's letting go of any kind of identity with external phenomena in terms of labels and names. And he says, just as Nagasana had listed, that we all have body parts, we have emotions, we have perceptions, but the point is that they don't add up to a cohesive, inherent me. That the sense of who we are, if we actually look at our experience moment to moment in meditation, we realize it's constantly changing. that our perceptions are different, our feelings are different, our intentions are different, what we think of, who we think we are, what we think we want to do, all of that changes from moment to moment. That there isn't a cohesive inherent me. And he says with this, therefore, it's possible to function as the mere I without misconceptions about the self, liberated from erroneous views. Erroneous views being any kind of fixed sense of this is who I am. As he says, especially in terms of erroneous views, especially the erroneous view that arises from the misunderstanding that the putting together of all these parts adds up to something real and independent in its own right. Something that's not contingent, not dependent on stories, narratives, and circumstances. Then he makes this another interesting statement. He says we're all the self-inflicted victims of mistaken identity. Self-inflicted victims of mistaken identity. When we confuse all these different pieces, all of these changing pieces, for an essential, immutable me, then we surrender control to the ego. We can learn how to make the ego function in a healthy, constructive way. The mere I functions without attachments. It's not always engaged in manipulating the world for its own satisfaction. He says, we seek the liberation that comes from recognizing the self that is not defined by grasping. We seek the liberation that comes from recognizing the self that is not defined by grasping. In other words, a self that just simply rests in present awareness without reference to any kind of fixed identity, and is therefore capable of recognizing its original state. And then, again, he engages in some dialogue with us and with himself. Then why am I on this journey, and what am I seeking? Right now, he says, I'm seeking to let go of the illusory hats that I'm wearing on this illusory head, and that live inside this mind that is falsified by confusion and muddled by misperception. The illusory hats are all the identities, all of the roles, all of the fixed views, perceptions, judgments, habitual feelings. All of that's what he's trying to work himself free of here. I'm seeking to let go of the illusory hats that I'm wearing on this illusory head, and that live inside this mind that is falsified by confusion and muddled by misperception. And it goes on to say, these hats have never existed. All of them are fake identities created by a fake identity mind, sustained by a fabricated constructive self, affirmed by warped perceptions held in place by habit. So there we have the nature of ego, that from moment to moment, the person that we think we are, the fixed mind, is something that's constructed moment to moment, and coming apart moment by moment, dying moment by moment to moment. And that when we actually are able to settle into nowness and see clearly without being bound by concepts, we come to realize this is true. And this is what he's been presenting in this entire chapter. Held in place by habit, and because they're not real, they can pass through. And he says, I'm not stuck with them. He says, I'll add them to the fire, toss the coiled grass rope of these hat identities onto the flames. And then he says, and then what? Will I turn to ash, become merely Mingyur Rinpoche? Or would he, and then he says, will I just become a corpse, a living corpse or a dead corpse? Being alive without waking up to the truth of emptiness is like joining the waking dead. So with that, he says he lay on his cot, neither rope nor ash, but somewhere in between. And that's where the chapter ends, and that's where I'm going to end for tonight. But we have some time for discussion, if people would like. Go. Any thoughts or people would like to share? Mark? And then Steve?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a little blackout here. So I missed part of it. Did we actually do a day at the GATS, or we didn't?
No, that's going to be next week, because,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
All right, then I guess I don't have a comment. Sorry.
The day of the Gats is even further taking what he's realized in meditation out into the world. And again, what he's talking about in this chapter is realizing something about the emptiness of phenomena and the emptiness of self, the egolessness of self and egolessness of other. And from the point of view of ego, that's desolation. But from the point of view of awareness, it's liberation.
I at the end of that chapter, he says something which really kind of, for me, was just great.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, if you can't show that you have a beginning, then
Mm-hmm.
you don't really have an end. Now, that's not an exact quote, but I'm not sure I'll be able to. But to me, that's the whole magic of the lives we live. That we don't. No matter. I'm not talking about me, the individual. I'm talking about what we come from,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that if we really have no beginning, which even we talk about certain things like the beginning of the universe, but all of that is speculative at best, and it's still they always kind of hedge their bet and say, well, it started with two molecules or two atoms that blew up, and it's just, to me, it just sounds so ridiculous, and ultimately it all comes from something.
Mm-hmm.
So if we really don't, logically, I don't believe we have a beginning, and therefore his conclusion in the chapter, I believe, is we don't really have an end.
Mm-hmm.
Things aren't as they seem, which to me is so exciting and wonderful, and that to me is very liberating. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
that's it.
That is very much an aspect of Madhyamaka teachings in particular, that you can't point to a beginning of mind, and Mahamudra as well, and I'm going to guess Dzogchen, that you can't, that neither beginning nor end.
Right, which is
Beginning, how can it end?
wow. It's just such an exciting practice and wonderful, and between logic or science, all of it, it's just fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very powerful. Whoops, very powerful at the end, where he says, "I'm seeking to let go of all the illusory identities, hats," he calls them, that he is wearing on this illusory head, and that live inside this mind that is falsified by confusion and muddled by misperception. Hats that have never existed, all of them fake identities. Fake identity minds sustained by a fabricated, constructed self, affirmed by warped perceptions, held in place by habit. He says, I will not be stuck with them. I will toss them in the fire. Wow. There is something to take completely to heart for each one of us. To toss all these fake identity minds that we carry around about who we are into the fire. Be free of them.
There's a great deal of instruction in these chapters about how we might work with our minds,
Really powerful.
beginning with just watching.
John, can I ask where you just read that?
Well, I'm reading it from my notes, but it's towards the end of the chapter.
It's right, yeah, it's right near the very end of chapter 11.
So 11. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I wrote it down here. I mean, it's just pointing out so vividly that the problem of our unenlightenment is we're living these false realities, like cartoon characters out of a comic book. And we're living them. And that what the path is about is throwing them into the fire. I will toss them in the fire, he says. Wow.
Tom? And then Steve?
Hey, thank you for the teaching tonight. I'm struck by that paragraph that John just read is so powerful. And there's almost, I don't know, an anger in it. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to tear this away. I'm going to leave this behind. I'm going to throw it in the fire. And it's to me so compelling the way he puts it. But that also brings up for me and so many teachings that we're being asked to hold these paradoxical concepts in our mind at the same time. That he is a High Lama, but he's not, and he is this and he's not, and we are this and we are not. It's an illusion or a conditioning. Just that alone, that sort of us being asked to hold these. I don't know if they're contradictory or just opposing or paradoxical sort of concepts in our minds at the same time is really, really interesting. And you really have to just be centered and open and let things pass through you to do that, or you get stuck in, you get hung up on one or the other. So that's something that just occurred to me.
No, I think you're right. And that's why, in some teachings they talk about being free of the two extremes, saying that it is or saying that it is not. And that it's, as he said, as his teacher says, it's both. And it does, from the point of view of conceptual mind, it is contradictory. But yeah, we can let go and experience things in a different way.
Without concept.
And there was something else, I think, an earlier chapter when they were talking about attachments and if you really try to release yourself from attachment, you're just going to become more attached. And don't let it go if you're not ready to let it go. And don't let it go if you're pushing it away. That's not really letting it go. And that really struck me as reaching retirement from my career and wanting to let it go, but I'm still attached to it, and it's really and I realize that I am. So I'm just going to accept that for the moment and see if there comes a moment where that passes. But it's really hard to make those transitions.
It is. Steve?
I don't really have a question. It's more of just a thought. As I was reading this, I just wondered if Mingyur Rinpoche, if he was born in the United this time, if he would not have been diagnosed with something on the autism spectrum or like a sensory disorder or something like that. Because I just thought that to get panic attacks from loud noises just sounded like a symptom of something I've seen some of my students have. And just I guess I was kind of seeing this as watching him use the teachings as like a way to manage this disorder that he might, if he could be diagnosed with. It was just a thought.
Yeah, it sounds like it was just panic attack alone. But yeah, there was a sensory trigger to it. But
Yeah.
or at least that's how he describes it. What I thought was interesting is the way he talks about the panic. The title of the chapter was "A Visit from Panic, My Old Friend,"
Right.
something like that. And that as you read through the chapter and see how his first thing was to try to get rid of it, but when he actually leaned into it, or just actually allowed himself to just be with it and just see it without trying to manipulate it, trying to make it go away, that it was really transformative. And that in that sense, in the sense that it wasn't just that he was able to work with the panic attacks, but that all that he realized as a result of working with the panic attacks in terms of emptiness and in terms of at least beginning to have a sense of identitylessness, that it really was his friend. It was like a very powerful teacher, you could say. But he had to let it into his life first and not try to just simply get rid of it or manipulate it or, get away from it. And in that sense, it opened things up rather than, shutting things down. To me, it was a really interesting chapter, and he goes through the different things that he, works through at each point. So that at first it was just being able to just watch without trying to control or manipulate. And then he began to see something of how it wasn't the external object, it was what his mind made of it, how his mind reacted to it. But that even then, as he says, he was still experiencing it dualistically. It was still good, bad, light, dark. And, just kept going further and further, looking. That's an expression Trungpa Rinpoche used to use from time to time. Look further, look further. And that's exactly what he did, look further. And saw the essential emptiness in the sense of it not being solid or real in any kind of permanent sense. And that's when he, where he began to realize all of these identities are just like hats that you could take off. You don't have to reject them or, whatever, but they're not part of who he really was. They were just something that he could just take off because it wasn't inherent to who he was. So in that sense, it was a great friend. Not the easiest friend to get along with, maybe, but a great friend.
And when we look at each other and consider what hats each one of us is wearing, you and you and you and you, each one of us, we all have a different hat, me. And we could take them off? Wow. What does the world look like then?
Hi, I'm sorry, I can't seem to find the hand raise
That's okay, we
little
got you.
icon. I just wanted to make a comment on what Steve said. So when your nervous system becomes so sensitized to the point where you begin having panic attacks, even when there's really no reason to panic, loud noises, crowds, anything like that, even if you walk into a room and you turn on the TV and the TV is too loud, it can just really jangle your nerves and set you into that panic spiral. So I don't think he's necessarily has any other underlying condition other than the panic. And I think in reading this, just it struck me that the strength, the mental, physical, spiritual strength that it took for him to leave safety, leave everything he's known, leave, and strike out on his own, which he had never done in his entire life, was, that alone is amazing. Even if he never wrote another word in the book, that alone is amazing. And to see him, the panic to start to come up for him again, and he starts to try to reason it away, and then he realizes, no, you can't reason it away. You have to make friends with it and live with it and allow it to be and just observe it. And just like we do in meditation, when a thought arises, we observe it and let it pass like it's floating downstream. When your body is screaming at you and every cell in your body is in panic and screaming at you, you need to get away, you need to do something, to have the strength to do that, just like that, the whole what he described on the train, to me was horrifying and almost set me into a panic attack. And I know this is a spiritual book, I get it, but I'm just saying from a human point of view, he's an amazing man for the ability to not give in to the panic when he's out there on his own with no support. That alone, I think, it kind of gives his story even more weight, and his retreat, if you will, even more gravity and meaning, to me personally anyway.
I think for me too, and I'm sure for most, if not all of us. Very powerful writing, teaching.
And you see again and again that the thoughts come up, but he doesn't identify with them. That this isn't, he doesn't say, oh, this is me, or this is real. And he catches moments. And we all do this. We have this happen in meditation, at least sometimes, I think. Well, I know that because I've listened to people, and I have my own experience, but I've listened to people in discussion group, and we have this ability. But it emphasizes why meditation is so important. Well, everyone is welcome to, if you can, the discussion group tomorrow night, right after meditation, beginning at 7:35. We can discuss further, share further. And unless there's something else that someone wants to share or ask, we could close by dedicating the merit.
We'll do it now.
Okay. So I will put up the chant, and we'll dedicate the merit generated through our study and practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom, may the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled, may all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory,